She walked those cold stone corridors carrying the weight of 2 lives and the quiet, terrible certainty that something was wrong. Her name was Janelle. And somewhere behind that heavy oak door lit by nothing but candle smoke and the low amber burn of secrets, the man she had given every piece of herself to was standing before the council of elders, speaking her name like it meant nothing at all. She had not meant to stop. She had been walking back from the healer's wing, her deep blue velvet gown pooling softly around her feet, her pace slow the way it always was these days. 5 months changed the way a woman moved through the world. It changed the way she breathed, the way she listened, the way she hoped. But then she heard his voice through the cracked door. Deep, calm, unbothered. And her feet simply stopped, her back pressed against the cold stone pillar, one trembling hand rising slowly to cover her mouth. The other came to rest as it always did now, instinctively, protectively over the gentle curve of her stomach. 5 months. She was 5 months along, carrying the child she had wept over in pure joy the night she found out. The child she had already whispered secret names to in the dark. The child she believed had sealed something sacred and permanent between her and Conrad, the most powerful alpha in the Silverfang kingdom. The child she had been so certain he wanted. Inside the council chamber, the voices continued, low, measured, deliberate. Through the thin gap of the cracked door, she could make out the shapes of them. Elder Cain near the far wall, his dark robes catching the candlelight. Elder Morrow and Elder Price, seated at the long oak table, faces carved from stone and indifference. Men whose cold eyes had always unsettled her at formal gatherings, but whom she had never had genuine reason to fear, until tonight. And then there was Conrad, tall, dark-haired, his heavy fur-lined cloak draped across his broad shoulders with the kind of effortless authority that filled every room he entered. His back was to the door. He did not know she was standing there in the corridor, 2 steps from shattering. He did not know that every word he spoke was landing like a blade. She heard him say it clearly. She keeps the pack content. His voice carried the same easy confidence she had once found beautiful. But, Seraphine, now that woman knows how to please a king. The elders chuckled, low, approving, familiar, as though this were not the first time they had spoken of it. Someone, Elder Morrow, she thought, asked if the rumors were true, if the Alpha King truly kept a noble-born mistress hidden from his Omega Luna. Janelle pressed her palm harder against her mouth. She waited. She waited for the denial, for the anger, for the sound of his fist hitting the table in offense, for the man who had once pressed his lips to her temple in the dark and whispered that she was the only soul in the world he had ever chosen freely. She waited, but Conrad only laughed, and the sound of it moved through her like cold water, through a cracked stone, slow, patient, and completely devastating. She did not scream. She did not push through the door. She simply stood there, suspended between the pale blue moonlight of the corridor and the warm amber glow spilling through the cracked door, and felt the entire architecture of her world come apart around her, quietly, completely, and without a single sound. The child inside her shifted. A small, soft movement, the kind that usually made her smile. This time, her eyes filled with tears. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one, and I love knowing how far this story is traveling. Now let's get into it, because what happens next will absolutely wreck you. It had not always been grief. There was a time not so long ago when Janelle had known something that felt almost impossible for a woman like her. Joy. Real, unguarded, terrifying joy. She had grown up in the outer rings of the Silverfang kingdom, the way Omegas learn to exist present but peripheral, useful but invisible. She had no noble bloodline, no family crest to display at council gatherings, no powerful father waiting to negotiate her worth across a long table of elders. What she had were her hands. Hands that could calm a fevered wolf with a single touch. Hands that had learned the language of wounds and pain before she ever learned to speak the language of power. Healing was all she had ever known. It was also, as it turned out, the thing that changed everything. because it was her gift that had brought her to the grand hall the night of the moon selection ceremony. And it was fate careless, rule-breaking, impossible fate that had placed her at the very back of a room full of noble she-wolves draped in silk and ambition. She had worn a simple blue dress. She had stood near the wall. She had planned to leave early. She had not planned on Conrad. The grand hall of Silverfang Castle had never been built for women like Janelle. She understood that the moment she stepped through its doors, the ceiling soared 50 feet above the marble floor, carved from pale stone and hung with banners bearing the silver wolf crest of the kingdom. Torchlight ran along both walls in long, shimmering lines, and the air smelled of cedar smoke, expensive perfume, and the quiet electric tension of ambition. Every noble she-wolf in the kingdom had come dressed to be chosen. They stood in rows near the front of the hall, daughters of generals, nieces of elder wolves, women whose bloodlines had been carefully cultivated for exactly this moment. Their gowns were silk and velvet in jewel tones. Their hair was pinned with silver clasps. Their posture was the practiced, elegant stillness of women who had been trained from childhood to stand before powerful men and look like destiny. Janelle stood near the back wall in a plain blue dress that had no particular story behind it. She had not come to be chosen. She had come because the senior healer she apprenticed under Old Master Fane, who had never once in 30 years allowed sentiment to interfere with duty, had insisted the entire healing staff attend as courtesy to the crown. So she came. She stood near the wall. She watched, and she spent most of the ceremony planning the quickest route back to the healing wing. She remembered the moment Conrad entered the hall, not because of the way the crowd parted, though it did, immediately and completely, the way water parts around something it cannot contain, not because of the ceremonial drums that announced him, or the heavy fur mantle across his shoulders, or the quiet authority that seemed to move ahead of him like a second presence. She remembered it because of his eyes, silver, sharp, scanning the room with the focused patience of a wolf who had never in his life looked for something he did not intend to find. He moved slowly along the front row. Noblewoman after noblewoman straightened as he passed. Small, practiced smiles, lifted chins, the particular stillness of women holding their breath in hope. Conrad walked past every single one of them. He kept walking, past the third row, the fifth, the seventh. The silence in the hall shifted from anticipation into confusion. Janelle noticed Elder Kane near the ceremonial dais exchange a sharp look with Elder Morrow. A whisper moved through the crowd like wind across still water. She was not paying attention to any of it. She had been watching the door near the side corridor, calculating the distance, when she became aware that the hall had gone completely, unnaturally still. She looked up. Conrad was standing in front of her, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw, close enough to see that those silver eyes that could silence a room of 300 wolves, were looking directly at her with an expression she had absolutely no framework to understand. "You," he said. One word. Quiet. Certain. Like a man who had just found something he had been searching for without knowing he was searching. And then he reached for her wrist. She remembered how her breath completely abandoned her as he turned her hand over and pressed the lunar mark against her skin, the ancient seal of the moon goddess, warm as sunlight and deliberate as fate. The hall erupted, not in celebration, in shock. She heard it all, the sharp intake of breath from the noble families in the front rows, the urgent murmuring that rolled through the crowd, the unmistakable sound of Elder Kane's voice cutting through the noise with cold authority. "My king, she is an Omega." Conrad did not turn around. "I know what she is," he said simply. And that was the last quiet moment Janelle had for a very long time. The weeks that followed were the most disorienting of her life. The castle staff learned quickly how to look through her not with cruelty, but with the particular blankness of people carefully avoiding a political complication they did not yet know how to categorize. Noble families sent formal letters of protest to the council. Elder Kane requested 3 separate audiences with Conrad in the first week alone. The other she-wolves, the ones who had stood in that front row in their silk gowns, did not bother with letters. They used silence. Cold corridors. Conversations that stopped precisely one moment before she entered a room. Janelle understood it. She did not enjoy it, but she understood it. She had never belonged here, Everyone in the castle knew it. The stone walls knew it. The banners with their silver wolf crest knew it. She reminded herself of this on the nights it became difficult to breathe. But then Conrad would find her. He always found her, somehow in the library late at night, or walking the east corridor alone, or sitting on the stone bench near the healer's garden, where the lavender grew wild and the moonlight came through clean and unobstructed. He never made a production of it. He would simply sit beside her, close enough that his shoulder touched hers, and say nothing for a long while. And on the night she confessed to him haltingly, quietly, that she was afraid the kingdom would never accept her, he turned and looked at her with those silver eyes and said the words she had stitched carefully into the walls of her heart. "I didn't choose you for the kingdom," he said. "I chose you for me." He took her hand. "You will always be safe beside me, Janelle. I swear it before the moon goddess herself." She believed him, completely, entirely, with everything she had. She would spend the next 5 months learning what a devastating thing it was to believe completely in a promise made by a man who had not yet met the limits of his own choices. Love, Janelle discovered, did not always announce itself. It did not arrive with drums or ceremony, the way Conrad had arrived at that grand hall. It did not declare itself across a room full of witnesses or press a mark into your skin in front of 300 wolves. It came quietly, in the spaces between everything else. It came on a Tuesday night in the castle library, 3 weeks after the selection ceremony, when Janelle had slipped inside after midnight because she could not sleep, and the healing wing felt too small, and the corridors felt too hostile, and she needed somewhere that belonged to no one in particular. She had not expected Conrad to already be there. He was sitting at the long oak table near the far window, a thick volume open before him, his fur mantle discarded over the chair back, and his dark hair slightly undone from whatever careful arrangement it had been in earlier. He looked, for the first time since she had met him, like a man rather than a title. He glanced up when she entered. She froze in the doorway, already forming an apology. "Don't leave," he said simply, and returned his eyes to the page. So she didn't. She found a book, an old pack history from the Western Territories, and settled into the chair nearest the window. And for 2 full hours they sat in the same room without speaking. And it was the most comfortable Janelle had felt inside the castle walls since the day she arrived. That was how it began. The library became theirs without either of them formally deciding it. 3 nights a week, then 4. Then most nights, one of them would arrive first and the other would follow. And no words were ever exchanged about it, because none were needed. They simply understood. Conrad was different in that room. The weight he carried everywhere else, the authority, the watchfulness, the careful control of a man who governed 300,000 wolves and could not afford to be misread. He set it down in the library, the way he set down his mantle, carelessly, without ceremony. He read histories obsessively, military strategy, ancient pack law, the kind of dense, unforgiving texts that would have put Janelle to sleep inside of 10 minutes, and he knew it. "You're not reading," he said one night, without looking up. "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" "About why a man who already runs a kingdom feels the need to read about other men who ran kingdoms." He looked up then, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on him before, surprised and unguarded, and somewhere very close to amused. "Because," he said slowly, "the ones who stop learning are the ones who lose everything." She considered that. "That's either very wise or very sad." "It's both," he said, and then quietly, almost reluctantly, he smiled. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile without a room full of politics behind it. She felt something shift in her chest, something she was not yet ready to name. The nights became conversations, not the careful, formal exchanges they performed in throne rooms and at council dinners, but real ones, the kind that started with something small and wandered far from where they began, the way rivers do when the land gives them room. He told her about the years before his father died, the pressure of a crown passed down before he felt ready to hold it, the loneliness of authority that no one around him seemed to understand or acknowledge, because powerful men were not supposed to name their loneliness. She told him about growing up in the outer rings, the particular skill of becoming invisible. How she had learned to read people the way other healers learned to read symptoms quietly, carefully, from a safe distance. "You were reading me," he said one night, not accusatory, simply realizing it. "Everyone reads everyone," she said. "I'm just honest about it." He laughed. A real laugh, low and unrestrained and entirely unprepared for. It moved through the room like something that had not been let out in a very long time. Janelle decided in that moment that she would spend considerable energy trying to make him do that again. She discovered she was pregnant on a morning in early frost season. She sat with the knowledge alone for 3 days, turning it over, examining it from every angle, trying to understand what it meant inside a life that still felt uncertain at its edges. On the 4th morning, she told him, she had planned to be calm about it, measured, to present it the way she presented difficult information to patients, clearly, gently, without unnecessary weight. Instead, the moment she said the words, her voice broke on the last one. Conrad crossed the room before she finished the sentence. He pulled her into his arms with a completeness that startled her, not the formal embrace of a king managing a complicated development, but the instinctive, total hold of a man whose body had responded before his mind could arrange itself. He didn't speak for a long moment. She could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. Fast, unsteady. Then he pulled back just far enough to look at her, and his silver eyes were bright with something she had never seen in them before. "My heir," he said softly. "My family." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Mine," he whispered, like a man who had spent his entire life ruling things that belonged to bloodlines and history and duty, and had only just, for the first time, been handed something that belonged entirely to his heart. The kingdom may not have accepted her. The elders may not have wanted her. The noble families may have written their letters and whispered their doubts and sharpened their quiet cruelties. But in that room, with his arms around her and his forehead against hers, and the first frost of the season pressing cold and clean against the window, Conrad had chosen her again. And that, Janelle told herself, was enough. For now, it was enough. The frost season brought 2 things to the Silverfang kingdom. The first was cold. The second was Elder Kane. He had always been present, of course seated at the long council table, watching Janelle from across formal dinners with eyes that never quite committed to any readable expression. He was the kind of man who had learned long ago that patience was a sharper weapon than anger, and he wielded it accordingly. But something shifted after the pregnancy was announced. The patience became urgency. Janelle first noticed it in the way the council meetings changed. They had always been frequent, twice a week, sometimes 3 times during governance seasons. But by the 2nd month of frost, Conrad was being summoned almost daily. She would wake in the early grey hours to find his side of the bed already cold, his cloak already gone from the hook near the door. He never told her what they discussed. She never asked directly. That was perhaps her first mistake. She heard pieces of it regardless. Castles, she had learned, were not built for secrets. Stone carried sound in unpredictable directions, through corridors, beneath doors, around corners that should have absorbed everything, and instead amplified it. She was passing the small antechamber near the east wing one afternoon when Elder Kane's voice reached her through the wall with terrible clarity. "An Omega Luna produces Omega perception," he was saying, his tone the measured, reasonable cadence of a man presenting self-evident facts. "The pack reads weakness at the top, and it spreads downward. It is not opinion, my king. It is pack law older than your bloodline." A pause. Then Conrad's voice, low and controlled. "The pack follows strength. I am the strength. For now," Elder Kane said. "But a king's strength is only as legible as the woman beside his throne. The nobles are already withdrawing alliance pledges. 3 border packs have sent inquiries about the succession legitimacy of an Omega-born heir." Janelle stood very still in the corridor. She had known this was happening in the abstract, the cold shoulders, the formal letters, the careful social exclusions that had followed her through the castle for months. She had known it intellectually. Hearing it spoken aloud in that flat, clinical voice was something else entirely. She walked back to the healing wing and sat for a long time doing nothing at all. Seraphine's name entered the castle the way most dangerous things did. Quietly, sideways, as though it had always been there and simply hadn't been spoken yet. It was Elder Morrow who introduced it first at a formal council dinner Janelle attended in her capacity as Luna. Seated at Conrad's right hand, while the elders arranged themselves around the long table with the careful geometry of men who had already decided the outcome of the evening. Elder Morrow had been speaking about noble alliances when he said it. The Ashvale family, of course, had long expected their daughter to be considered for the selection, a pause that lasted precisely one beat too long. Seraphine Ashvale is, by any measurable standard, an exceptional she-wolf. Noble bloodline, political connections reaching 3 border kingdoms. The pack respects her. Another pause. The pack would follow her. The table was quiet. Conrad said nothing. Janelle kept her face completely still and reached for her wine glass with a steady hand and reminded herself that she was a healer. She had learned stillness under pressure long before she ever learned anything else. But she felt the name settle into the room like a stone dropped into still water, and she watched, from the corner of her eye, as not a single elder looked at Conrad when Morrow said it. They all looked at her. The distance did not arrive suddenly. That was the cruelest part of it. It came the way frost came gradually, so gradually that each individual morning felt almost identical to the one before it, until one day you looked up and everything familiar had gone cold without you ever witnessing the exact moment it happened. Conrad still came to the library, but less frequently. He still reached for her hand at formal dinners, but with the slight mechanical quality of a man performing a gesture he had not fully thought about. He still asked about her health, about the baby, about whether she needed anything from the healer's stores. But the questions came from the doorway now. He asked them on his way somewhere else. She began to notice the way he looked sometimes when he returned from council meetings, a particular tightness around his eyes, a set to his jaw that spoke of conversations that had not gone cleanly. She would catch him staring at the map on his study wall, his fingers spread across the border territories, his expression somewhere far from her. She told herself it was governance, the weight of a kingdom, the natural pressure of a man carrying more than one person should reasonably carry. She told herself a great many things in those weeks, and she almost believed them. Almost. But there is a particular instinct that healers develop, an awareness of the space between what a person says and what their body quietly confesses, a sensitivity to the subtle wrongness that precedes a crisis, the way certain animals feel a tremor in the earth long before the ground begins to shake. Janelle had that instinct, and for the first time since Conrad had pressed the lunar mark against her skin and looked at her like she was the only soul in the room worth finding, it was telling her something was wrong. She just wasn't ready yet to hear what it was saying. She had not meant to walk past the council chamber that night. She had been restless, the particular bone-deep restlessness of late pregnancy that made sleep feel like something happening to other people in other lives. The baby had been active for hours, pressing and shifting with the relentless energy of a child who had not yet learned that the world outside required stillness sometimes. So she walked. The east corridor was quiet at that hour. The torches burned low, casting long amber shapes across the stone floor. Outside the narrow windows, the kingdom lay dark and frost-covered, and entirely indifferent to the small, private crisis assembling itself inside her chest. She was thinking about nothing in particular when she heard his voice. She stopped 6 steps from the council chamber door. It was cracked open not widely, just enough to let the candlelight spill in a thin, warm line across the corridor floor. Just enough to let sound through with perfect, devastating clarity. Conrad was speaking. She recognized the tone immediately, the one he used in formal settings, when he was performing confidence rather than simply possessing it. Smooth, deliberate, calibrated for an audience. She should have kept walking. She did not keep walking. "The Omega situation is being managed," Conrad said. Elder Kane's voice followed. "The noble families require more than management, my king. They require reassurance. Visible reassurance. Then they'll have it." A pause. "Seraphine Ashvale has been patient," Elder Morrow said. His voice carried the particular satisfaction of a man arriving at a point he had been building toward for a long time. "Her family has been patient. There is only so long a noble house of that standing will wait before they begin looking at other kingdoms to align with. Seraphine understands the arrangement, Conrad said. Something cold moved through Janelle's stomach. Does she? Cain again. A dry, almost amused edge beneath the formality. And what exactly is the arrangement, my king? For the record. A beat of silence. Then Conrad's voice, easy and unbothered, and utterly careless. She keeps the pack content. Janelle keeps the moon. Goddess appeased. The bond is legitimate. The air carries my blood. The ceremony was lawful. A pause. But Seraphine, now that woman knows how to please a king. The council laughed. It was not cruel laughter. That would have been easier to hold. It was the comfortable, relaxed laughter of men who had been in the same room together for years. The laughter of people sharing an understanding that had existed long before tonight. Long before Janelle had ever walked into a grand hall in a plain blue dress and believed that fate had chosen her for something real. Someone asked directly. Elder Price, she thought the quietest of them, which made the question somehow worse. The Luna doesn't know? The Luna, Conrad said, believes what she needs to believe. Later, Janelle would not be able to identify the precise moment her heart broke. It was not a single fracture. It was not dramatic. It was more like watching a structure she had been living inside, one she had trusted completely, had pressed her hands against and called solid, had built her entire sense of safety around, simply revealed that it had never had a foundation at all. She believes what she needs to believe. She pressed her hand over her mouth. The other hand moved to her stomach. The baby shifted beneath her palm, slow, gentle, entirely unknowing, and Janelle stood in the corridor between the moonlight and the candlelight and understood with the quiet, terrible clarity of a healer reading a wound that was already too far gone that she had never been loved. She had been used, carefully, deliberately, even kindly, perhaps, in the way that powerful men could be kind to useful things, but used. The moon selection ceremony, she had believed it was fate. She understood now that it had been calculation. An Omega Luna produced a legitimate bond without a rival noble house gaining power through the match. No political debt, no dangerous alliance, no family whose influence could grow to challenge the throne. Just a woman with healing hands and no dangerous connections. Just a woman who would believe what she needed to believe. The child inside her moved again. Janelle closed her eyes. She did not burst through the door. She did not scream his name into the candlelit room or throw the weight of her grief at the feet of the men who had engineered it. She was a healer. She had learned to function in the presence of pain long before she had learned almost anything else. She simply turned and walked back down the corridor. And somewhere between the council chamber door and the entrance to the private Luna quarters, something that had been soft and hopeful and entirely trusting inside her went very, very quiet. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time in the dark, not crying, not yet, just sitting with the new shape of things. And when the tears finally came, they were not violent or loud. They were the slow, exhausted tears of a woman who had already done the work of understanding, who had already moved past the shock and arrived at the cold, clear place that comes after. She looked down at the lunar ring on her finger. The silver band caught the moonlight from the window. She thought about Conrad's voice. Easy, unbothered, entirely careless. She believes what she needs to believe. Janelle wiped her face with the back of her hand, straightened her spine, and made the only decision that had ever truly belonged to her alone. She was leaving, before sunrise, before he returned from that room, before she lost the nerve or worse, before she stayed. She did not pack the way she had arrived. She had arrived with almost nothing, a small trunk of healer's clothes, her apprenticeship texts, a few personal items that fit inside a single worn leather bag. Conrad had insisted on filling the lunar quarters with things she had never owned before. Silk, silver, the kind of quiet luxury that had taken her months to stop feeling like a guest inside. She left most of it exactly where it was. What she took told the story of who she had been before Conrad, before the Grand Hall, before the Luna Mark, before she had allowed herself to believe that fate had reached down into the outer rings of the Silverfang Kingdom and chosen a healer with no noble blood and no dangerous connections for something real. Her healer's satchel, her apprenticeship texts, 3 practical dresses, the kind that traveled well, that did not require help fastening, that would draw no particular attention in a crowd. The emergency savings she had kept in a small wooden box behind the loose stone in the wall near the window. Old habits from a childhood where safety was never something other people provided for you. She had not touched that box in over a year. She was grateful now for the version of herself that had kept it anyway. She moved through the lunar quarters slowly, carefully, with the particular deliberateness of a woman who understood that she was memorizing things at the same time she was leaving them behind. The window where the morning light came through clean and gold in summer. The small shelf where she had arranged her healer's texts alongside the pack histories Conrad had brought her from the library, because she had mentioned once, only once, in passing, that she found the Western Territories fascinating. He had remembered. She had not known then what to do with a man who remembered small things. She knew now that remembering small things and being honest about large ones were entirely different skills, and that a man could possess one completely while lacking the other entirely. She did not let herself stand at the shelf for long. She went to his study last. It was the room in the castle that smelled most like him. Old parchment and cedar, and the particular cold night air that came through the window he always left cracked, regardless of the season. The great map of the Silverfang Kingdom covered most of the east wall, its borders marked in dark ink, its territories labeled in the careful hand of a cartographer who had understood that power needed to be legible to the people who held it. Conrad's desk sat beneath the map. She stood in the center of the room for a long moment, not moving. Outside, the kingdom was dark and frost-covered and entirely silent. The hour before sunrise had its own specific quality of stillness. Not the stillness of peace, but the held-breath stillness of the world, balancing on the edge of something. Janelle reached for the lunar ring. It came off more easily than she expected. She stood holding it for a moment, that small silver band that had marked her as something she was now understanding. She had never truly been, and felt its weight in her palm with the focused attention of a woman committing a sensation to permanent memory. Then she set it down at the center of the map, not on the outer rings where she had come from, not near the border territories. At the center, at the heart of it, a quiet statement that cost her nothing now and had cost her everything. She did not leave a letter. There was nothing she wanted to say that those few inches of silver could not say more cleanly. She left through the healer's exit on the south side of the castle. It was a narrow door cut into the stone wall 3 centuries ago for the practical purpose of moving the sick in and out without disturbing the main corridors, unremarkable, unguarded, entirely beneath the notice of a castle that organized its security around the entrances that mattered to powerful people. Janelle had used it hundreds of times. She used it once more now. The cold hit her immediately. The sharp, clean cold of pre-dawn frost that had no patience for the kind of grief that moved slowly. She pulled her traveling cloak tighter across her stomach and walked. She did not look back at the castle. She had learned young that looking back at things you were leaving served no practical purpose. It did not change what you were walking away from. It only made your feet heavier. She traveled south for 3 days, by cart where she could arrange it, on foot where she could not. She stopped at a way station on the second night and slept for 4 hours on a narrow bench near the fire, her satchel against her chest, the baby still and quiet for once, as though it too understood that this was not the moment for restlessness. By the 3rd morning, she had crossed the boundary line, human territory. The landscape changed almost immediately, the wild, dense forest of wolf-pack lands giving way to open roads and the distant geometry of human towns, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of cartwheels on stone, people moving through their lives with no awareness whatsoever of pack law or elder councils or the particular violence of loving someone who had never intended to keep you. Janelle stood at the edge of the road and breathed it in. Then she adjusted her satchel, straightened her spine, and walked forward. Behind her, the Silverfang Kingdom receded into the tree line, and the woman who had been Luna disappeared entirely. What walked forward was simply Janelle, a healer, alone, and utterly, resolutely free. The city of Varen did not care who she was. That was the first thing she noticed about it, and the thing she came to love most completely in the weeks that followed. It was a mid-sized human city built along a river, practical, unhurried, organized around the logic of commerce and seasonal work, rather than bloodlines and pack hierarchy. Its streets smelled of bread and river water and coal smoke. Its people moved with the particular self-contained busyness of those who had enough of their own concerns to leave other people's alone. Nobody knew what the lunar mark meant. Nobody recognized the faint silver trace of Omega lineage in the way she moved or carried herself. Nobody looked at her and saw a political complication. She rented a room above a bakery on the city's eastern edge, 2 small windows, a narrow bed, walls that held the warmth of the ovens below from early morning until well past midnight. The baker was a wide, practical woman named Dora, who asked no questions beyond whether Janelle could pay the first month in advance and whether she had any objection to the smell of cinnamon. Janelle told her she had no objections at all. She had the first decent sleep she'd had in weeks that night, wrapped in the warmth of borrowed heat, the distant sound of the river moving steadily beneath the window. She built her practice carefully. Word traveled the way it always did in tight human neighborhoods quietly, person to person, carried on the back of someone's relief. She began with small things: a dock worker's infected hand, a child's persistent fever that the local physician had addressed, with remedies that were technically correct and practically useless, an elderly woman whose joint pain had been dismissed for years as simply the cost of aging. Janelle had learned long ago that the body rarely lied if you knew how to listen to it. Within 6 weeks, she had more work than she could comfortably manage. She charged what people could pay and asked no questions about what they couldn't. She kept her hours consistent and her manner calm, and her opinions about her patients' choices entirely to herself. Among the small population of wolves who lived quietly in Varan, those who had left pack life for reasons of their own and preferred the anonymity of human cities, word spread differently, more carefully, but with the particular intensity of people who recognized genuine skill when they found it. She did not advertise those services. She did not need to. Elias arrived on the first night of true snowfall. Janelle had known it was close. She was a healer. She had understood her own body's timeline with clinical accuracy for weeks, but knowing and experiencing were different countries entirely, and she was grateful beyond measure for Dora, who turned out to possess both a remarkably steady temperament and a surprisingly comprehensive knowledge of midwifery acquired through the practical education of having delivered 3 of her own children without adequate help. The snow came down outside the bakery window in large, unhurried flakes, and somewhere between midnight and the first pale suggestion of morning, her son was born. She held him against her chest in the narrow bed above the bakery, while the snow continued its quiet work outside, and Dora moved efficiently around the small room, and the ovens below sent their warmth up through the floorboards, and she felt something shift so completely inside her that she understood she was not the same person she had been 30 seconds before. She had known she would love him. She had not known it would feel like this, like every previous version of love she had experienced had been a study for this particular final exam. Like everything before had been approximate. He was dark-haired, her hair exactly, fine and black and slightly damp against his small head. But when he opened his eyes for the first time and looked up at her with the unfocused, ancient attention of the newly born, they were silver, not grey. Not the ambiguous pale blue of most newborns that resolved itself into something ordinary in the weeks that followed. Silver. Sharp and clear and unmistakably, heartbreakingly familiar. Dora, leaning over her shoulder, said simply, "Unusual color." "Yes," Janelle said quietly. "He has his father's eyes." She did not say anything else about it. The years settled around them with the steady, ordinary rhythm of a life being built from the ground up by someone who had learned not to need much in order to find it enough. Elias grew the way children do, in sudden, startling increments that made Janelle feel simultaneously that no time had passed at all and that entire landscapes had shifted while she wasn't paying attention. He was curious in the way she was curious, quietly, persistently, with a particular focus that tended to unsettle adults who expected children to be easily redirected. He was gentle with small things, injured birds, nervous cats, the elderly patients who came to their door in the early mornings when the cold made joints ache and pride made asking for help difficult. He had her hands, but those eyes, those silver eyes that caught light the way certain metals did, that sharpened when he was thinking and softened when he laughed, that occasionally made Dora look at him sideways with an expression she never quite put into words. Those belonged to someone else entirely, and on certain quiet evenings, when the snow came down outside the bakery window and Elias sat across from her doing his lessons by lamplight, Janelle would look at her son's silver eyes and feel the old grief move through her like weather, present, then passing, then gone, until the next time. He returned to the lunar quarters just before dawn. The council meeting had run long. It always ran long these days. The elders circling the same political anxieties with the patient repetition of men who believed that speaking a problem loudly enough and frequently enough eventually constituted solving it. Conrad had sat through 3 hours of it with the focused stillness of a man who had learned early that the most powerful thing he could do in a room full of people trying to provoke a reaction was to simply not provide one. He was tired in the specific way that had nothing to do with sleep. He pushed open the door to the lunar quarters and knew immediately. He could not have explained how he knew. There was no dramatic evidence of absence, no overturned furniture, no scattered belongings, no visible sign of anything wrong. The room was quiet and dim, and almost entirely ordinary. But the particular quality of the silence was different. A room that contained a sleeping person had a specific kind of stillness inhabited, breathed into, warm at its edges. This was the other kind. The kind that had not held a living presence for several hours. Conrad stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he moved through the room quickly, checking each space with the systematic focus of a man whose instincts had already arrived at a conclusion his mind was still refusing to process. The healer's satchel was gone. The apprenticeship texts from the shelf. The small wooden box behind the loose stone near the window. He had known about it. Had always known about it. Had never once mentioned it. Because he understood that a woman who had spent her life providing her own safety did not stop needing that option simply because someone promised to provide it for her. The box was gone. He sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed his hands against his knees and breathed. He found the ring in his study. He had gone there without entirely deciding to, moving through the castle corridors with the automatic quality of a man whose body was navigating while his mind was somewhere else entirely. The study door was already open. The cold night air came through the cracked window the way it always did. He saw it immediately. The silver band, sitting at the center of the map. He crossed the room and stood before his desk and looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he picked it up. It was such a small thing, such a simple, quiet statement. No letter, no explanation, no accusations, laid out in careful sentences for him to argue with or defend himself against. Just the ring, at the center of the kingdom, he had chosen over and over again, in ways he had never been fully honest about. Not with the council, not with Janelle, and most damningly, not with himself. He closed his fist around it, and then, with the slow, specific dread of a man assembling pieces he would have preferred to leave scattered, he began to understand. He went back to the council chamber. He stood in the corridor outside the cracked door, the same corridor, the same thin line of candlelight across the stone floor, and replayed the previous evening with the merciless precision that had always made him an effective king and was currently making him feel like he might come apart at the structural level. He heard his own voice, easy, unbothered, entirely careless. She believes what she needs to believe. He pressed his palm flat against the stone wall. The conversation had been a performance. Every word of it calculated, deliberate, constructed for the specific purpose of convincing the council that he was willing to abandon his Omega Luna, that Seraphine Ashvale represented a genuine alternative, a real arrangement, a king making the politically sensible choice. Because Elder Kane had come to him 3 weeks earlier with information that had no safe response. The council had been meeting privately, without him, planning the removal of an Omega Luna whose continued presence they had decided was an unacceptable liability to the throne. Not removal the way political men meant removal, not exile, not formal dismissal. The other kind. Conrad had done the only thing available to him in that moment. He had given them a reason to wait. a suggestion of inevitability that he was already moving toward what they wanted, that patience would deliver what interference might complicate. Seraphine had never been his mistress. She had been a name, a fiction, a lie deployed in a room full of dangerous men to keep the woman he loved alive long enough for him to find a permanent solution. And Janelle had been standing in the corridor. She had heard everything. He understood now with a clarity that arrived far too late and cost far too much, that he had protected her from the council's plan and walked her directly into a different kind of devastation, one she had carried alone, in silence, and then disappeared into the dark, with before he had any idea she had been in that corridor at all. 5 months pregnant. Alone, because of words he had spoken, he did not sleep. By the time the grey suggestion of morning arrived at the study window, Conrad had already sent for his most trusted tracker, a wolf named Soren, who had found things that did not want to be found for 15 years, and had never once come back empty-handed. He placed the lunar ring at the center of the map. She went on foot, Conrad said. South, most likely. She would have chosen human territory. Soren looked at the ring, then at the Alpha King's face. He had the good judgment not to ask questions. I'll find her, he said. You'll find her, Conrad agreed. His voice was quiet, absolute, the voice of a man who had spent years governing a kingdom and had only just understood what it was he actually stood to lose. And when you do, you will not approach her. You will not speak to her. You will tell no one. He picked up the ring. You will come directly to me. Soren found her in the 4th year. Conrad had known it would take time. Janelle was not a careless woman. She had built her disappearance with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything else. And the human world was vast and indifferent and genuinely uninterested in helping wolves find each other. Soren had tracked false leads across 2 countries before a healer's reputation in a river city called Varen finally gave her away. The thing about genuine skill, Conrad had reflected when Soren delivered his report, was that it was almost impossible to hide completely. He came alone. He had considered bringing guards, an escort, something that communicated the formality of what this was, a king crossing international territory to find his Luna, his heir, the woman he had failed in the most complete and irreversible way available to him. But formality felt like the wrong language for what he actually owed her. So he rode south with only Soren and dismissed him at the city boundary. He found the bakery on the eastern edge of Varen without difficulty. He stood across the street from it for a long time. He saw the boy first, a child of perhaps 3 years, sitting on the front step of the bakery in the early morning with the focused concentration of a small person engaged in important private business, arranging a collection of smooth river stones into a pattern that apparently required significant deliberation. Dark hair. Conrad went very still. Then the boy looked up, distracted by some sound from the street, and across the distance, Conrad saw his own eyes looking back at him from a child's face. Silver, clear, unmistakable. He had known, intellectually, that Janelle had been 5 months pregnant when she left. He had done the arithmetic in the cold, months after her disappearance, and understood that somewhere in the world, a child of his existed. He had carried that knowledge for 4 years like a stone pressed against the center of his chest. Actually seeing it was something else entirely. He stood on the street in a human city, far from everything he governed, and felt the full weight of what his carelessness had cost arrive all at once, without mercy, the way it had been waiting patiently to do since the night he stood in that council chamber and spoke words he had not considered carefully enough. Janelle came through the bakery door 10 minutes later. She was carrying a small basket and talking to the wide woman behind her, her landlady, Conrad assumed, and she was laughing at something, a real unguarded laugh, and the sight of it stopped him in a way he had not prepared for. She had built a life here, a real one. Visible in the easy way she moved through the street, the familiar nods from the people she passed, the small hand that immediately reached for hers when the boy noticed her coming through the door. Then she looked up and saw Conrad standing across the street. The laugh stopped. Everything stopped. She sent the boy inside with her landlady. Conrad watched her do it. The quiet words, the gentle hand on his small shoulder, the practiced calm of a mother removing her child from a situation before he could understand it well enough to be frightened by it. Then she walked across the street and stopped 6 feet away from him and looked at him with an expression he could not fully read, which had never happened before, not once in all the years he had known her. "You found us," she said. Her voice was steady. "Of course it was. I should have found you sooner," he said. Something moved across her face. Not softening, not yet. Something more careful than that. "Say what you came to say, Conrad." So he told her everything. All of it, Elder Kane's private meeting, the council's plan, the specific and terminal nature of what they had intended for her, the calculated lie about Seraphine, deployed in that room to buy time, to convince dangerous men that patience served them better than action. The night he returned to find her gone, and stood in his study holding her ring, and understood too late what she must have heard and what it must have meant to her. He told her without defense or softening. He owed her the full truth, with no architecture around it. When he finished, the street was quiet between them. Janelle stood very still, her arms crossed against her chest, her eyes on the middle distance. He recognized that expression, now the one she wore when she was doing the internal work of a healer, examining something painful and trying to determine whether it was survivable. "You let me believe it," she finally said. "I didn't know you heard. You still let a version of it exist. In that room, with those men." "Yes," he said, because there was no honest answer that wasn't yes. Another silence. "She has his eyes," Dora had told him once, years ago, meeting Elias, though Conrad didn't know that yet. He would. "His name is Elias," Janelle said quietly. "He arranges stones by weight. He's gentle with hurt things." A pause. "He has your eyes, and he has never once been told to be ashamed of what he is." Conrad closed his eyes briefly. "I know I don't deserve." "No," she said. "You don't." She looked at him then fully, directly, with the complete attention of a woman who had spent 4 years becoming someone who no longer needed anything from him. But he might deserve to know his father. She turned back toward the bakery. "Come inside, Conrad. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But a door left open." And Janelle, who had walked away from everything once, with nothing but a leather satchel, and the quiet certainty of a woman who knew her own worth, stood in the doorway of the life she had built and chose, with full knowledge of the cost, to let the question remain unanswered a little longer. Some things, she had learned, deserved more than one conversation. Some loves the broken ones, the complicated ones, the ones that had failed you in the worst possible way, sometimes asked, not whether they were worth forgiving, but whether they were worth the harder work of understanding. She didn't know the answer yet, but she left the door open. And that, for now, was everything. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe for more moonlit romance stories like this one.